They thought the silence would break me. My children, Michael, Sarah, and David, had always imagined I'd become a ghost haunting these quiet rooms, forever clinging to the echoes of their laughter, their demands, their careless footsteps. When the last moving van pulled away, leaving behind a profound, unfamiliar hush, they believed they were leaving me to an empty, desolate life. And for a time, I allowed them that misconception. I even felt it myself, in those first few weeks, as dust motes danced in sunlight where their toys once lay. But silence, I've since learned, isn't always a void to be filled with sorrow. Sometimes, it's the rich, dark soil where something entirely new, something unexpectedly vibrant, can finally take root. What if that quiet absence wasn't the end of my story, but merely the turning of a page, a blank canvas just waiting for the masterpiece of my own design? The last box had gone, then the last goodbye, a hurried kiss on my cheek from David as he rushed to join his siblings in the car. Then, just like that, the front door closed, not with a bang, but with a soft click that echoed through the entire house. The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was a physical presence, heavy and vast, pressing against the walls, filling every corner that had once overflowed with the clamor of my children. I stood in the entryway, the scent of Michael's cologne still faintly clinging to the air, mixed with the lingering sweetness of Sarah's perfume and the faint, youthful musk of David's room. For years, this house had been a symphony of arguments, laughter, television static, and the endless clatter of plates. Now, it was a sudden, deafening void. My own breath felt loud in my ears, and the gentle tick-tock of the grandfather clock, a sound I hadn't truly distinguished in decades, seemed to hammer against the quiet. I wandered through the rooms. Sarah's bedroom, meticulously organized but sterile now, lacked the vibrant chaos of her ambition. Her books were gone, her awards packed away. It was as if she'd meticulously erased herself, leaving no trace of the years I'd spent ensuring she had the space to thrive. Michael's study, once his fortress of business calls and late-night projects I'd quietly supported with endless coffee refills, felt like a museum exhibit. Everything essential to him had vanished. And David's space, stripped of his gaming console and posters, felt the most jarring, a stark reminder of the carefree spirit I'd always tried to nurture, even when it meant neglecting my own. They had built their lives on my steady ground, like seedlings drawing nutrients from the soil, but when it was time for them to bloom, they simply plucked themselves free, never truly acknowledging the roots that had sustained them. It wasn't anger I felt, not yet. It was more like a slow leak, the air seeping out of a balloon until only a shriveled skin remained. I was that shriveled skin, left behind in a nest that had become too large, too silent. Days bled into weeks. The phone, once a demanding tyrant, now slept in silence on the kitchen counter. My calendar, usually a patchwork of reminders and appointments for was starkly blank. I'd find myself staring at it, the pristine white squares mocking me with their emptiness. I had always been Eleanor, the mother, the keeper of the home, the silent architect of their comfort. Without those roles, who was I? A question that hung in the quiet air, a ghost of a query echoing in the hollow rooms. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, as I sat by the window, watching the drops streak down the glass, a peculiar thought took hold. The silence wasn't just a lack of them, it was an abundance of me. For the first time, there was no urgent call, no dinner to prepare, no crisis to avert. The quiet wasn't just a wound, it was a vast, open field. A field that had been fallow for too long, but now, finally, stretched out, waiting for its own harvest. It was a faint, almost imperceptible shift, like the gentle turning of a key in a forgotten lock. The empty rooms, once just silent, began to hum with memories. Not the sweet, nostalgic kind, but the sharp, insistent echoes of 1,000 tiny cuts. Each discarded item, each blank space, became a portal to a time when their thoughtlessness, like a slow drip, had worn away at my spirit. I walked through the house, the silence no longer just a neutral field, but a canvas where old scenes played out, vivid and unwelcome. I remembered Michael, always too busy for a simple phone call, but never too busy to drop off a pile of receipts at tax time, expecting miracles. "Mom, you're so good with numbers," he'd say, a casual compliment that felt like a chisel chipping away at my time, my energy. He never saw the hours I spent hunched over his haphazard records, ensuring his successful image remained unblemished. My suggestions, my quiet observations about his business, were met with a patronizing pat on the hand, dismissed as the musings of a woman who didn't understand the real world. My world, apparently, was only valuable when it served his. Then there was Sarah. Fiercely independent, she prided herself on needing no one, a virtue she'd surely learned from me, though she'd never acknowledge it. Her calls were sparse, always a monologue about her latest achievement, her next big move. "I'm just so grateful I have the freedom to pursue my passion," she'd often say, never once pausing to consider whose tireless efforts had provided the very launching pad for that freedom. My life, my needs, were invisible beneath the glittering facade of her ambition, a forgotten backdrop to her unfolding drama. She saw me as a fixed point, like a sturdy old tree, always there, never needing water, and David, my youngest, whose youthful exuberance I'd adored, masked a profound lack of consideration. He'd leave laundry overflowing, dishes stacked, assuming the fairies would come and tidy up. When I'd gently remind him, he'd flash that charming, disarming smile and say, "Oh, Mom, you're the best. I knew you'd handle it." It wasn't malice, I knew. It was simply a deep-seated expectation, like gravity, that I would always be there to catch him, to clean up after him, to make his path effortless. He saw my efforts as a natural extension of the universe, not as conscious acts of love and labor. These weren't grand betrayals, not the stuff of dramatic confrontations. They were the everyday betrayals, the paper cuts of emotional neglect that accumulated over decades. Each one, a tiny piece of me, discarded or overlooked. I had been their rock, their quiet strategist, their endless well of support. And they had been the careless sculptors, taking more than they gave, shaping me into an outline of a person, defined solely by my function to them. As the melancholic memories washed over me, a familiar ache settled in my chest. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a familiar sadness, it was a cold, quiet anger taking root. It felt like the truth of things, stripped bare. I found myself drawn to a small, dusty box tucked away in the back of my study closet. Inside, beneath old photographs, was a worn leather journal. Its pages were filled not with sentimental poetry, but with meticulously recorded figures, investment notes, and small, forgotten calculations, numbers I'd quietly managed, decisions I'd discreetly made over the years, far from their notice. Their disregard had made me invisible, yes, but invisibility could also be a kind of shield, a cloak for plans unseen. The leather-bound journal felt cool against my fingers, a forgotten artifact from a life I'd lived in the shadows. Its pages, stiff with disuse, smelled faintly of old paper and hidden ambition. This wasn't a diary of emotions, but a ledger of liberation. For years, while my children carved out their futures on the foundation I provided, I had quietly, systematically, been laying bricks for my own. They never saw it, of course. Why would they? My world, to them, was the domestic sphere, a well-oiled machine that ran itself. But while Michael bragged about his stock portfolio, ignorant of the small, consistent contributions I'd made to my own, I was learning. While Sarah declared her independence from all things traditional, I was researching. And while David spent his youth oblivious to the cost of living, I was calculating. Every grocery budget I stretched, every coupon I clipped, every penny I saved from the household allowance or from the small, freelance transcription work I did late at night went into a separate account. An account they never knew existed, tucked away in a small, local credit union that felt delightfully anonymous. I flipped through the journal, my fingers tracing the precise columns of numbers. Each entry was a tiny act of defiance. A particularly large chunk had come from the unexpected sale of my grandmother's antique jewelry, pieces they deemed old-fashioned and advised me to just hold on to. I'd sold them discreetly, investing the proceeds in stable, long-term options, a decision made entirely without their expert input. It was a secret wellspring, steadily flowing, accumulating silently beneath the surface of my visible life. There were notes about property, too. Small, unassuming parcels of land that I'd learned about from local auctions, researching late at night when everyone else was asleep. One particular entry stood out, a small, neglected cottage on the outskirts of town, just beyond the old mill pond. I'd driven past it countless times, always admiring its hidden potential, its quiet remove from the bustling main roads. A place where the birds sang louder than traffic. It had always seemed a fantasy, a whisper of a different life. But here, in the cold light of the ledger, were actual figures, calculations, and even an old listing price I'd torn from a paper years ago. Their neglect had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for my escape. Because they saw me as incapable of anything beyond managing a home, they never questioned my quiet dedication to household finances. They never suspected I was building a different kind of household altogether. It was like tending a secret garden, hidden behind a tall, overgrown hedge. While they admired the manicured lawn of their own lives, I was cultivating something wild and free, meant only for me. The cold anger from Chapter 2 hadn't receded, it had solidified into a calm, potent resolve. This journal wasn't just a record of savings, it was a blueprint, a map to a future they had no claim on, a future where I was no longer a background character in their stories. My independent journey had begun years ago, in the quiet spaces between their demands. The journal became my compass, pointing me towards a future I'd only dared to sketch in the margins of my mind. The cottage, that unassuming entry, beckoned with a peculiar urgency. It wasn't just a fantasy anymore, it was a destination. The silence of my empty house no longer felt like a prison, but a launchpad. I spent hours online, delving into property records, local zoning laws, and even articles about historical preservation in our county. My fingers, accustomed to sorting bills and scheduling appointments, now flew across the keyboard, fueled by a newfound, exhilarating purpose. One crisp autumn morning, a Tuesday, I drove out to see it again. It was the same cottage I'd admired for years, tucked away behind a stand of old oak trees, just beyond the quiet murmur of the old mill pond. This time, I didn't just drive past. I parked my car a little way down the lane, out of sight, and approached on foot. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The path leading to the front door was overgrown, choked with thorny brambles and resilient weeds. The windows were clouded with grime, and a loose shutter clattered faintly in the breeze. It looked forgotten, neglected, much like I had felt for so long. But as I pushed aside a thick vine to peer through a dusty pane, I saw past the decay. I saw the sturdy bones of the structure, the solid chimney, the gentle curve of the roofline. It needed a hand, a patient heart, a vision. And something stirred deep inside me, a warmth spreading through the space where the cold anger had settled. This wasn't just a house, it was a project, a canvas. It was a tangible thing I could pour myself into, something that would bloom under my care, not demand it. I walked around the perimeter, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. The small backyard was a wilderness, but I could envision it cleared, a space for herbs, for quiet reflection. Near a moss-covered stone wall, I noticed a patch of wild lavender, its faded blossoms still clinging to slender stems. It had survived, thrived even, despite the neglect. And as I knelt, gently touching the resilient plant, a thought blossomed in my mind. I could bring this place back to life. Not for anyone else's approval, not for their comfort, but for my own. This wasn't just about financial independence, it was about self-reclamation. The cottage, battered and overlooked, was a reflection of me, and its revival could be my own. It was more than a whim. It was a profound sense of connection, a whisper of a future that hummed with possibility. This quiet, neglected place held the key to unlocking a part of myself I hadn't realized was lost. It was the perfect escape, a place where I could not only live, but truly begin. I paused, letting the cool breeze wash over me, a feeling of deep, quiet peace settling in my chest. The financial entries in my ledger were no longer just numbers, they were the fuel for this new, beautiful fire. And in the corner of my eye, I noticed a subtle shift in the terrain near the pond, a rise in the land that looked unusually fertile, hinting at secrets the earth held. With the journal as my anchor, I plunged into the practicalities of making the cottage a reality. My days, once dictated by the rhythms of others, now hummed with my own quiet agenda. I contacted the real estate agent whose number I'd carefully logged years ago, surprised to find the property still available, though barely remembered. The process was slow, a dance of paperwork and legalities, but I approached it with the same methodical patience I'd once applied to balancing household budgets. Every form filled, every signature given, felt like a deliberate step away from the life I'd been expected to live and into one I was forging for myself. I devoured books on home renovation, not just for the technical know-how, but for the sheer satisfaction of learning. I'd never been the type to wield a hammer, always delegating such tasks to my husband or, later, to Michael, who considered himself quite handy, mostly with a phone. Now, I found myself studying diagrams of joists and beams, understanding the language of old houses. I practiced small repairs on my own home first, a leaky faucet, a squeaky door hinge. Each successful fix a tiny victory that resonated far deeper than any "thank you" I'd ever received from my children. My kitchen, once a hub of family meals, transformed into a makeshift planning center. Blueprints for the cottage, printed from the town archives, lay spread across the counter. I sketched out garden designs, researched native plants, and even began to learn about beekeeping, an old fascination I'd never had the luxury to pursue. It felt almost subversive, this quiet acquisition of knowledge, this meticulous crafting of a future they never once envisioned for me. They imagined me adrift, perhaps knitting by the fire, certainly not becoming a property owner and budding amateur architect. The thought of their surprise, a gentle ripple of satisfaction, was a powerful motivator, but not the primary one. My true drive came from an internal well, a desire to prove to myself that I was more than a role, more than a reflection in their eyes. This was my canvas, my clay, my own life finally taking shape. I even began visiting a local nursery, chatting with the owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had a wisdom about plants that went beyond mere horticulture. She spoke of old traditions, of planting by the moon, and hinted at certain areas of our region where the soil remembered deeper secrets. Near the mill pond, she once mused, tracing a line on a map with a gnarled finger, "There's always been talk of an unusual richness, like something ancient settled there long ago." Her words were a curious echo of my own observation, a subtle confirmation of the land's unique promise. This life I was building, brick by quiet brick, was a testament to my own enduring spirit. It was patient work, often lonely, but it was mine. Each decision, each effort was a deliberate act of self-definition, weaving a tapestry of independence that they, in their casual oversight, had made space for without ever knowing it. The cottage purchase completed, I began my subtle retreat from the vestiges of my old life. It wasn't a grand, dramatic exit, but a slow, almost imperceptible fading. My children, absorbed in their own orbits, barely registered the shift. They still called, occasionally, usually when they needed something. Michael would ring for a quick, "Mom, can you just look over these figures?" expecting the usual immediate availability. Sarah would text, a rushed, busy, but doing great. Before asking about a family heirloom she might want. David would drop by unannounced, looking for a home-cooked meal, his usual charming assumption that I'd be waiting with open arms. But I was no longer waiting. My responses became measured, less immediate. "I'm a bit busy right now, Michael." Perhaps later in the week, I'd say, a phrase that would have been unthinkable a few months prior. When Sarah inquired about her grandmother's locket, I simply replied, "Ah, yes. I handled that some time ago. It's quite safe." No explanation, no details. Just a quiet closing of a door they hadn't known was open, and when David appeared, a hopeful look in his eyes, I'd offer him a sandwich from the deli, rather than a full meal, explaining, "I'm afraid I haven't had time for cooking much lately." So many projects. Each interaction was a tiny thread cut, a delicate withdrawal. I started spending more time at the cottage, tending to the wild garden, clearing the brambles, sketching plans for its interior. I often left my old phone on silent at home, only checking messages once a day. My physical presence in their lives became less reliable, less central. It wasn't a punishment, it was a consequence. I was simply mirroring the level of engagement they had shown me for so long. They noticed, of course, but their observations were fleeting, easily dismissed. Michael grumbled about my newfound hobbies, making me less available. Sarah mused, "Mom's finally living her own life, good for her," a casual remark that carried no real curiosity about what that life entailed. David just seemed bewildered by the lack of instant gratification. They interpreted my distance through the lens of their own self-interest, never truly questioning the root cause. They thought I was simply getting on with things, as mothers do. What they didn't know was that with every piece of ivy I pulled from the cottage walls, with every weed I cleared from its garden, I was also entangling myself from their unspoken expectations. The cottage became my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of my growing independence. It was a place where their demands couldn't reach, where the only expectations were my own. My old home, the one they still occasionally visited, was merely a staging ground now, a temporary stop before retreating to my true domain. I watched them, listened to their fleeting comments, and felt a quiet, knowing smile touch my lips. The gap between their perception and my reality was widening, an invisible chasm I was purposefully creating. This subtle, strategic distancing was more potent than any shouted word. The phone rang, a frantic, insistent jangle that cut through the quiet hum of my newly purposed days. It was Michael. His voice, usually so clipped and confident, was laced with an unfamiliar tremor. "Mom, you have to help me. The tax auditor. They're questioning everything. My records are a mess, and I can't find that expense report from 2 years ago. You always kept track of those things for me." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. "You should still be doing it." I listened, a strange calm settling over me. "Michael," I said, my voice steady, "I haven't managed your finances in quite some time. All those documents were in your study, clearly labeled, when you moved out." His pause was heavy, a dawning realization that the invisible hand that once sorted his chaos was no longer at his service. A few days later, Sarah called, her usual effervescent tone replaced by sharp frustration. My pitch went horribly. The presentation looked amateurish, and I just couldn't pull it all together. "You always used to make sure everything was perfect, remember?" She was talking about the graphic designs, the perfectly proofread text, the meticulously organized data sheets that she would hand over to me at the last minute, expecting a polished miracle by morning. "Sarah," I replied, gently, "you're a brilliant creative. I'm sure you'll find a way to refine your process." The silence on her end was a different kind of void, one filled with the unsaid understanding that her seamless professional image had relied more heavily on my background efforts than she cared to admit. Then came David, not with a phone call, but a desperate knock on my door. His usual boyish charm was gone, replaced by genuine distress. He'd lost his part-time job, and without the small buffer I used to secretly tuck into his account each month, he was facing immediate eviction from his cramped apartment. "Mom, I don't know what to do." I thought you'd always make sure I had enough to get by." He looked at me, bewildered, as if the laws of nature had suddenly changed. "David," I explained, "those little extras were meant to help you build your own foundation, not to become a permanent subsidy." He sat on the edge of the sofa, looking truly lost, the safety net he'd unconsciously relied upon suddenly, dramatically, gone. Their calls, their visits, were not pleas for help so much as expressions of shock. They were experiencing what happens when the unspoken, unacknowledged support system, the one they never had to ask for, simply vanishes. It was unsettling for them, a world suddenly rendered less forgiving. I could hear it in their voices, see it in their eyes, not regret yet, but a raw, dawning awareness of a fundamental absence. After David left, the house felt quiet again, but this time it wasn't a painful emptiness. It was a productive quiet. I drove to the cottage, the afternoon sun dappling through the trees. The unruly backyard, once a dense thicket of weeds, was slowly transforming. I had started clearing a large section, guided by Mrs. Henderson's advice and my own instincts about the subtle rise in the land. As I dug my spade into the dark, rich earth, it was exactly as she'd described, teeming with an unusual vitality. The soil itself felt alive, brimming with a quiet, ancient promise, ready to nourish whatever I chose to plant. It was a stark, tangible contrast to the barren ground my children now found themselves standing on. The frantic calls didn't stop after their initial shock. Michael's voice, a few days after our last conversation, was edged with genuine panic. "Mom, they're threatening fines. I don't know where anything is. Please, just tell me what to do. You always knew how to make sense of my messes." It was the old song, a familiar melody that used to tug at my heartstrings. But this time, the notes fell flat. The urge to dive back into his convoluted paperwork, to smooth over his self-created problems, flickered for a moment, a muscle memory of a past life. Then, it settled. "Michael," I said, my voice as calm as a still pond, "this is your business, your responsibility. You have to learn to manage it yourself. The information is all there, somewhere in your files." He sputtered, incredulous, but I simply held the line, offering no lifeline, only the unwavering expectation of his own competence. Sarah's emails became a torrent, filled with self-pity and blame. Her once gleaming career was showing cracks without my uncredited support, and she was furious. "I can't believe you're not even trying to help. Don't you care about my career? My reputation?" Her words, designed to sting, bounced off a shield I had spent years quietly forging. I replied with a concise message, "Sarah, I care deeply about your well-being. But your career is yours to build and maintain. You have all the talent you need. No apology, no explanation of my new priorities. Just a firm boundary, held steady like a seawall against an incoming tide." David's situation was perhaps the hardest to witness, yet my resolve remained unshaken. He needed a place to stay, a loan to cover his rent until he found another job. He painted a picture of bleak desperation, knowing how easily I'd succumbed to his pleas in the past. My heart ached, a deep, familiar throb, but my mind held firm. I invited him for tea, offered advice on job searches and budgeting, suggested resources for temporary housing. But when his eyes, wide and pleading, met mine, I shook my head gently. "David, you have to find your own feet. You're strong enough to do this. I cannot do it for you." It was a decision made with clear eyes, not a cruel heart. My silence, my steadfast refusal to rescue, was not an act of vengeance, but an act of liberation, for both of us, though he couldn't see it yet. Each denial, each refusal, felt like pulling a weed from deep soil. Painful for a moment, but necessary for the garden to truly thrive. I was systematically dismantling the unspoken agreement that had governed our lives, their demands, my immediate, silent service. They had always seen me as an extension of their needs, a utility. And now, the utility was offline. There was no joy in their suffering, only a quiet, resolute satisfaction in holding my ground. I wasn't punishing them, I was simply allowing the natural consequences of their own disregard to unfold. For so long, I had smoothed their paths, hidden their follies, absorbed their carelessness. Now, they were walking on ground they had personally left untended, and the uneven terrain was their own to navigate. My decision was not made in anger, but with the cool precision of a long-term strategy, a fundamental shift in the tectonic plates of our family dynamic. My focus was on cultivating my own neglected soil, not attempting to refertilize theirs. The air at the cottage sang a different tune now. Not the heavy silence of absence, nor the haunting echoes of neglect, but a vibrant hum of life. Months had flown, a blur of paint, plaster, and patiently tilled earth. The cottage, once a forgotten shell, was a beacon of soft light and warm wood. Its windows, sparkling clean, looked out onto a garden that was my masterpiece, a living canvas born of my hands and my long-held dreams. I had chosen a variety of heirloom roses for the patch near the mill pond, a species known for producing an exceptionally fragrant oil, but notoriously difficult to cultivate. Mrs. Henderson, the nursery owner, had given me a knowing wink when I mentioned my choice, hinting that some places just have the magic for certain things. I'd remembered her words, and the subtle, fertile rise in the land I'd observed. I'd poured my heart into those roses, nurturing them as diligently as I'd once nurtured my children, but with a crucial difference. These roses returned my care with unburdened beauty. Today was the first full harvest, and as I walked among the dew-kissed bushes, the scent was intoxicating, richer than any I'd ever encountered. The blossoms were larger, their petals a more vivid hue, almost glowing against the morning light. It wasn't just a good harvest, it was an extraordinary one. The soil, just as Mrs. Henderson had suggested, had indeed held ancient secrets, a richness that had coaxed these roses into something truly magnificent. Each bloom was a silent testament to my perseverance, my hidden foresight. My fingers, once soft from domesticity, were now calloused, stained with earth, strong. As I carefully clipped each perfect rose, placing it into a woven basket, a profound sense of triumph washed over me. It wasn't the loud, attention-grabbing triumph Michael sought in his business dealings, nor the glittering, public achievement Sarah craved. It was a quiet, deep-seated joy, an inner validation that resonated in my bones. This was real. This was mine. I had envisioned it, planned it, and brought it forth with my own two hands, guided by my own intuition, on my own terms. The thought of my children, struggling in the messy gardens of their own making, flickered, but it didn't dim my light. Instead, it highlighted the brilliance of my own, hard-won bloom. They had underestimated me, dismissed my quiet strengths, taken for granted the fertile ground I once offered. And now, I was cultivating my own land, producing a harvest far richer than anything they could comprehend. Later that afternoon, I contacted a small, artisanal perfumery I'd researched online. The owner, a woman named Clara, was initially skeptical. But when I brought her a small vial of the oil I'd painstakingly extracted from the first batch of petals, her eyes widened. "Eleanor," she breathed, holding the vial to her nose, "this is exquisite. I've never smelled anything quite like it. It has a depth, a complexity, a memory, almost." She spoke of rare qualities, of an unexpected purity, and offered a contract that surpassed my most optimistic calculations. Standing there, in my newly warm and subtly scented cottage, holding the signed contract, I didn't feel vindictive. I felt free. The bitterness had dissolved, replaced by a sweet, clean taste of independence. This wasn't about what they lost, it was about what I had found. The seeds of self I had planted years ago, in the hidden corners of my life, had grown into a vibrant, thriving reality. The empty nest wasn't empty at all. It was overflowing with my own blossoming future, a testament to what happens when an underestimated woman finally plants her own roots in her own soil. My true inheritance wasn't from them, but from myself, unlocked by my own unwavering hand. The sweet, clean scent of rose oil now permeated my cottage, a gentle reminder of the vibrant life blooming within its walls. My days were filled with the satisfying rhythm of harvesting, distilling, and meticulously preparing the precious essence for Clara's perfumery. The first order had been large, the next even larger, driven by the unexpected buzz Clara reported. My name, Eleanor, was now associated not with mundane domesticity, but with an exquisite, rare fragrance. I rarely sought news of my children, but the world, in its own way, brought them glimpses of me. Michael was the first. He worked in the city, always touting his connections. Clara, it turned out, had a sister who was a prominent figure in Michael's social circle. Word of the exceptionally unique local rose oil and its mysterious source had spread. I heard it through a casual remark from Mrs. Henderson, who mentioned Michael had called her, quite out of the blue, to inquire about that land near the mill pond. He'd asked about me, she'd added, with a twinkle in her eye, said he heard you were quite the entrepreneur. The irony was a delicate, perfectly brewed cup of tea. Michael, who dismissed my every financial insight, was now forced to acknowledge my success through the very channels he deemed important. I imagined his carefully constructed facade of business acumen cracking just a little around the edges. Sarah, ever tuned to the latest trends and image, likely stumbled upon it online. Clara's perfumery, now featuring Eleanor's heirloom rose elixir, had gained traction in a few lifestyle blogs, even a local magazine piece about artisanal producers. The article, tastefully done, included a photograph of me, not the tired, invisible woman they remembered, but a woman with kind eyes and hands stained with earth, smiling beside my flourishing rose bushes. Sarah, whose own career was still struggling to regain its footing after her disastrous presentations, must have seen it. The thought of her scrolling through, perhaps even sharing it with a feigned, casual admiration, brought a quiet, knowing smile to my lips. The mother she considered a relic was now featured in the very world she so desperately tried to impress. David's discovery was perhaps the most poignant, and the hardest for him to reconcile. Still hopping between temporary jobs, his apartment situation precarious, he had less access to the world of business or online trends. But a friend of his, passing through town, saw me at the farmer's market, selling small bouquets of my common roses alongside bottles of Clara's new fragrance. The friend, recognizing me, mentioned it to David. "Your mom, man," he'd apparently said, "she looked happy. Really happy. And her roses smell incredible." David later left a curt voicemail, "Heard you were doing well, Mom. Good for you." There was no warmth, no genuine joy for me, only a stark, unavoidable contrast to his own barren circumstances. Their reactions were fragmented, secondhand, but clear enough. They saw, they heard, they processed, each in their own way, the undeniable evidence of a life thriving without them. It wasn't about gloating, it was about the simple, profound truth. I had filled my empty nest, not with sorrow, but with the rich, vibrant tapestry of my own design. Their regret, nascent and uncomfortable, was a seed they had planted themselves. The news of my burgeoning enterprise, Eleanor's heirloom rose elixir, continued to ripple through their separate worlds, no longer just glimpses but stark, undeniable truths. And with each ripple, a deeper, more painful understanding began to settle upon my children. Michael, my eldest, the master of appearances, had always dismissed my contributions as quaint domesticity. He'd never truly believed I understood the intricate dance of finances or the cutthroat world of business. His panicked calls about tax audits had evolved into something else. One evening, the phone rang, and it was him. Not asking for help, not blaming, but a hesitant query about the market for specialty botanicals. He'd clearly done his research. "You always had a knack for finding value where others didn't, Mom," he admitted, his voice low, almost grudging. "I should have listened to you more about those smaller investments, back then." It wasn't an apology, not truly, but a concession. He wasn't just realizing what he'd lost in terms of convenience, he was seeing the actual, tangible financial genius he'd overlooked, the strategic mind he'd dismissed as merely good with numbers. The facade of his own self-sufficiency was cracking, revealing a deep, hollow dependence on the very wisdom he'd scorned. The full weight of his past dismissals was settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Sarah, whose carefully curated life revolved around achievement and external validation, eventually couldn't ignore the articles and features. A mutual acquaintance, meeting me at a local artisanal fair where Clara and I were showcasing the elixir, later gushed to Sarah about my incredible talent and visionary spirit. The next day, I received a text from Sarah, devoid of her usual exclamation points. "Mom, I saw the piece in Local Living. It's impressive, truly. I never realized you had such a head for business, or such a green thumb." The words were polite, almost stiff. It wasn't the feigned admiration from before, it was a dawning, bitter recognition that the freedom she so cherished was now overshadowed by my genuine, self-made success. Her own career, still floundering after a string of setbacks she now had to navigate entirely on her own, contrasted painfully with my quiet, soaring triumph. She was seeing that the woman she'd always considered a background player had, in fact, been the most significant force in her life, a foundation she had chipped away at, brick by careless brick. David's realization, born of his continued struggles, was rawest of all. Having moved into a dingy, shared apartment after losing his job, he rarely called. But one unusually cold morning, he appeared at my door, unshaven, his eyes hollow. "Mom," he started, his voice barely a whisper, "I messed up. I really messed up. I always thought you'd be there. To fix things. To make it easy." He looked around my bright, fragrant cottage, a world away from the barren rooms he inhabited. "You always did so much for me. Everything. And I never saw it, did I? Not really. I just took it." There were tears in his eyes, not of self-pity this time, but of genuine, painful comprehension. He saw the enormity of my quiet labor, the ceaseless giving, and the complete absence of reciprocation on his part. He was seeing the true cost of his carefree existence, and it was etched on his face, a map of regret. I listened, quietly, offering no comfort, no "I told you so." It wasn't my place to heal their wounds, they had to tend to their own barren soil. Their pain wasn't my vindication, but their realization was my freedom. It was a liberation for me to know that the truth, unspoken for so long, had finally found its way home to them, settling deep into their awareness, a hard-won, undeniable weight. They finally understood the extent of the gifts they had squandered, and the profound value of the woman they had lost. The seasons turned, painting my cottage garden with an ever-changing palette of greens and golds. My life here was a quiet symphony of purpose. The rhythm of the harvest, the comforting scent of rose oil, the occasional visit from Clara discussing new products, or Mrs. Henderson sharing old wisdom. My hands, once symbols of endless service, were now instruments of my own creation, strong and sure. I walked my property, feeling the rich earth beneath my feet, a grounding sensation that settled deep into my soul. This was my sanctuary, built not on demands, but on dreams, tended with love and quiet defiance. My children still called, though less frequently, and never with the old assumptions. Michael, now facing the full complexities of his business alone, had learned a harsh lesson in accountability. He was quieter, more thoughtful, though still focused on his own world. He sometimes mentioned seeing articles about Eleanor's heirloom rose elixir, and would concede, "You really did well, Mom." Unexpectedly well. His grudging admiration was a small, dry seed of acknowledgement, but it offered no path to rekindling the past. He was simply living with the knowledge of what he'd let slip through his fingers. Sarah's emails had shifted from defensive to distant, a polite formality. Her career continued to be a turbulent sea, and she was learning, painfully, that success was not just about ambition, but about the steady, unseen work that underpins it. She had found a new, quiet respect for the tireless effort she'd once taken for granted. Her freedom, once so brightly proclaimed, now felt fragile, shadowed by the true, profound independence I had cultivated. She saw me, truly saw me, as a woman of substance, not just a supporting character in her own grand narrative, and that sight, I sensed, was a heavy burden. David, after a difficult year, had found stability in a new city. His calls were rare, brief updates on his progress. He had learned, through hard knocks, the fundamental truth about standing on his own 2 feet. The bewilderment was gone, replaced by a somber understanding of his past entitlement. He'd never say it directly, but in the quiet pauses of our conversations, I could feel the weight of his regret, a silent echo of the lost connection, the mother he had not truly known until she was gone. I felt no desire for their apologies, no need for reconciliation that would erase the hard lessons they were learning. My liberation wasn't contingent on their forgiveness, nor was it defined by their sorrow. It was a complete, internal emancipation. The bitterness I once felt had evaporated like morning dew in the sun, replaced by the warmth of self-respect. My purpose now sprang from within, not from external roles or expectations. My empty nest was not empty at all. It was teeming with life. The buzzing of the bees I now kept, the vibrant colors of my expanding garden, the creative energy of my work, and the serene peace of my own company. I was no longer an echo, I was a song, composed by my own hand, sung for my own joy. And as for my children, they were left with the enduring, quiet regret of what they had lost, and the profound, undeniable truth of what they had never truly appreciated. My peace was my triumph, and it was complete. Eleanor's journey, wasn't it a testament to the profound power of quiet resolve? We often hear about grand gestures of revenge, but sometimes, the sweetest victory is simply building a life so rich, so entirely your own, that those who overlooked you can't help but see it. Her story reminds us that even after years of having your spirit chipped away, you can still find the strength to plant new seeds in your own fertile ground. And for her children, that lingering, enduring regret they faced was the silent echo of every moment they failed to truly appreciate her. If Eleanor's journey of self-reclamation and quiet vindication resonated with the depths of your own heart, then you know you're in the right place here at Vengeful Echoes. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story where underestimated souls rise to claim their undeniable justice. May your own path be filled with purpose, your courage always unwavering, and may you find the deepest joy in cultivating the beautiful life you truly deserve.